With the Panthers struggling to score goals, we discuss what potential trade targets the Florida Panthers could be looking at.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Wednesday, December 20th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News, and you can follow me on X at MondoMan12. Follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. And shout out to the everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So today's show is going to be a fun one. We're going to be not necessarily all over the place, but we're going to just evaluate a little bit, but then also talk about possible players that the Florida Panthers could be bringing. Maybe it's via trade, which we are still months away. So we're not expecting any of these to happen right now. But also, we're going to discuss more about once the roster freeze is up, whether the Panthers could be bringing in some players from the AHL. But it is a Wednesday, which it means it is a Winans Wednesday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, which means Jacob Winans is back. Jacob, I want to give you the floor for a little bit and just give you some opening thoughts on just the end of the road trip as the Florida Panthers now return home for a 2-game homestand.
Yeah, I think the road trip as a whole was a little bit of a letdown. I think the energy was lacking. I feel like they kind of ran out of gas at the end of it, and I think offensively there's a lot of issues to work on. I feel like the production down the end of the lineup is not there, and it's becoming an issue when Sam Reinhart's not scoring. It feels like no one is. So they took advantage of a bad Columbus team. And honestly, that game could have gone differently if Eric Goodbranson hadn't completely lost his mind in that game. I feel like the Panthers were losing control of that one a little bit when that happened. Kind of bailed them out. And then Edmonton, they took advantage of a goaltender who's really and this is no disrespect to Calvin Pickard, but he's not a solidified NHL player. He's more of a journeyman, more of an AHL guy. A third goalie. They really took advantage of a goalie in a really tough position in that game. So fortunate to get those 4 points, but the other 3 games, it was really lifeless. It was really the creativity wasn't there, the offense wasn't there, the depth scoring definitely not there. And I feel like when those things aren't going, the effort's got to be a little bit higher. And I feel like especially in the third period against Calgary, the first period against Vancouver. Third period against Seattle, I feel like there just really wasn't much there. It felt like more of a lack of effort than anything.
Yeah, and you see in all those 3 losses for the Florida Panthers, there was for them it was always that one period that got to them that really cost them the game. For Vancouver, it was early on. For Seattle, it was later, and the same thing for Calgary, it was later on. But still, you see stretches of the game that the Florida Panthers at points were dominant. So it wasn't a full 60 minutes of just being completely dominated. I know the shots on goal in Vancouver were double that had double the shots, but for context, once again, that was because the Panthers were playing from behind and the Canucks were playing more conservatively there. So with that, but Paul Maurice did speak after the game against Calgary. He's like he liked the first 40 minutes and all. And most times, if you're gonna play like that in the first 40, you're gonna come more on the winning side more often than not. But there are a few encouraging things for the Panthers here as far as where they are right now. I mean, 5-2 in 1-goal games, over 500 there. And here's also the thing. At this point last year, we were wondering if the Panthers were ever going to get a 3-game winning streak, and that didn't happen until late January, early February when it started. At this point, December 20th at 9:05 a.m., the Panthers still don't have a 3-game losing streak. So that's very encouraging. I know they lost 3 out of their last 4. This is basically the quote unquote biggest stretch of losing for the Florida Panthers basically this season, if you don't count if you don't count the first of two games of the season. But also 18 road games versus 13 home, and they're 9-7-2. They finished 19-19-3 last year, so very road heavy to start as well. And also, Jacob, here's the thing: goals for in 21 playoff games for the Panthers last year was 2.95. What during the regular season it was 3.51. So about a little bit more than half a goal less during the playoffs. Their goals for is not that different in this regular season. It's actually 2.94, so 1/100th of a point. But also that argument of, but when the playoffs come around, it's going to slow down even more. You can't expect that 2.94 to stick, which is very valid as far as that. So that is where you're scratching your head as far as that, because still Matthew Tkachuk is at a 4.5 shooting percentage as well. But you're also still seeing this. The Panthers win more games when they're outshot, actually, as far as percentage wise, which has only happened 5 times, versus when they're outshooting the opposition, which has happened 24 times, 12, 10, and 2. What do you make of that when hearing that for the Panthers as far as how it's gotten them to here?
I think they're an opportunistic team. I think that's really what that points to, and I think that also points to the fact that they tend to lock it down once they have a lead. When the Panthers are at their best, they get a lead and then they shut down the opposition. That's really the style they like to play. We talk about how good the Panthers are when they score first. One of the best teams in the NHL when getting the first goal, and they're very, very good and very adept now at getting a 1, 2, 3 goal lead and then slamming the door for the rest of the game. And I think that's where you're seeing that stat where the Panthers have such a solid record when being outshot, because they have no problem getting a lead, scaling back the offense, letting their goalie make saves, block shots, and keeping the shots from the perimeter. When they have leads, the shots tend to come from the perimeter from the opposition. It's not a lot of high danger stuff. It's not a lot of odd man rushes. They get into their structure and then they shut it down. And those perimeter shots are not usually that threatening, and you can allow a lot of them. It's not really going to make a difference because those are easy to see, easy to save. So I think the key is getting leads and then shutting things down. And they've struggled to be able to do that in the past few games, especially on this road trip. It's hard to play that lockdown style when you can't get on the board, and getting shut out twice, and then only having 1 goal against Calgary, and then you make a mistake, and then it's really pretty much game over from there. You have to be able to play with the lead. You can't be chasing the game, because it gets the Panthers way out of their style when they're having to chase the game. It's not the same team we saw a couple years ago where they would get down and then make miraculous comebacks and win games that way. It was exciting. It's fun regular season hockey, but this is a team now that plays a playoff style, and playoff style hockey. You're not clawing back and making crazy comebacks. You need to be in the lead and shutting the game down from there.
Yeah, and going back to when they score first, 12-0-2, and none of those 2 overtime losses have come on home ice. So that's a very encouraging sign, as they're going to get more home games coming down the stretch. And the benefits of the Western Conference road games is after their next West Coast trip, which will be in the first week of January, they'll only have two central teams remaining on their schedule, which are short trips to Dallas and to Nashville in separate road trips as well there. So that's when it comes to travel, it's going to be a lot lighter for the Florida Panthers as well. So that's an encouraging sign. But also when it comes down to leads and also going back to Monday, the faceoffs for the Calgary Flames was 61% to 39. And a lot of people are probably thinking, what faceoffs aren't really the be all end all. But when the Calgary Flames were winning their faceoffs, they were able to set up their D in order to block the shots, instead of the Panthers getting a quick win on the draw and then maybe a quick shot to the net. So that is unblocked. So something worthy there, especially when the Calgary Flames have the lead. You're able to get into your structure a lot better. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2. We're going to discuss more about possible trade targets that the Panthers could be going after, as the trade deadline is about 3 months away. We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. And there's all sorts of possibilities where Sam Reinhart could score 50 goals. The Panthers could hoist the Stanley Cup, and you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy contests. All you have to do is pick studs like Sam Reinhart, Alexander Barkov, Connor McDavid, or Nathan McKinnon, who was on a 15-game point streak. If they will record more or less their sleeper projections like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, or more in a given game. And to win 100 times your bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me, Cats fans. You can win 100 times your money on playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. Use code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today has you covered 24/7 on the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national 24/7 streaming channel. Back on this Winans Wednesday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Wednesday. And once again with Jacob Winans here. Jacob, so just we know about the Florida Panthers issues to get the pucks to the net. And I want to once again reemphasize Matthew Tkachuk talking about not wanting to cheat the game for more offense as well. But it doesn't mean that the Panthers will be looking for it doesn't mean that they won't be looking as far as getting that extra punch as far as scoring. So and we've spoken about all the cap issues that I don't want to call them issues, how tight they are against the cap right now. And even with the rise in the cap, it's still going to be tight for the Florida Panthers. So when you're thinking about a guy who just got scratched recently over the weekend not over the weekend, yesterday, in Andrei Kuzmenko, I quickly looked up his contract. Doesn't look like, I don't think the Panthers are going to be going after him, especially with term as well. So once again, to give you guys the state of the Florida Panthers as far as draft capital, no ones nor twos in the next draft. They do have a fifth from the Claude Giroux trade. No ones in 2025, but added a conditional fourth from the Tkachuk trade and a fifth from the Anthony Duclair trade for 2025. So there's something to play with. But once again, I spoke about last week about the trade to set up another, and whether it's a guy who makes $1 million in salary, like maybe a Nick Cousins, but does management like him enough that because he was part of the playoff mix to keep him around? But we've seen a little bit of boneheaded mistakes from Nick Cousins, and that's excluding everything on Eric Branson. He had a boneheaded mistake that I saw last night that had me scratching my head. So I wanted to look at guys who the Florida Panthers could be looking at, and they're some guys who are the Panthers probably can't afford, like a Jake Kensel, an Elias Lindholm, and a Tyler Toffoli. Those guys are probably guys who are the Panthers aren't able to bring in as far as that. Guys who are probably on contenders but likely not traded. Daniel Sprong, Max Domi, Tyler Patuzzi, Sam Lafferty. Those are guys that you probably uh, won't be traded. But also there are the categories of guys that probably don't fit. We've seen the Mike Hoffman experiment here in South Florida, but also it sounds great to bring in Vladimir Tarasenko. It sounds great on paper, but then you talk about going away from what the Panthers structure is, as Tarasenko is more offense first, but will that, if he's on a line with Lundell and Etu Luostarinen, does that line suffer as far as defense as well? But then there's like a sweet spot possibly for the Panthers. There is, and a few guys that I've thought of was Nick Foligno is one, but even though the Blackhawks are towards the bottom of the standings, does Kyle Davidson want to take away a guy to mentor Connor Bedard, because he already lost Taylor Hall to injury, Corey Perry and his off the ice issues as well. So that's also a possibility. I know this is a name that will probably trigger Florida Panther fans, but Adam Henrique is one. He's not a super expensive contract, 10 goals and 8 assists, so that's some scoring punch. But also, there's a guy who was a 7-time 20-goal scorer here as well, but hasn't gone to that point since because of injury the last few years. But he's healthy this year. And the Panthers will probably don't have to do the whole 25% remaining salary for this guy. And that's Sean Monahan of the Montreal Canadiens. Most of his 20-goal scoring came when he was in Calgary, but that could be a target that that Bill Zito could be aiming for. One that I don't think could happen, but I would like to see, even though he played for the opposition in the Stanley Cup final, Chandler Stevenson. Swiss Army knife, can go anywhere in the lineup. He's due for a payday, and he's a 2-time Stanley Cup champion as well with Washington and with Vegas. Of the guys here, if there are some names that you saw the same, but what are there any other names that I didn't mention that you think Bill Zito could be looking at?
Yeah, I agree on a couple of those names. Number one on my list would definitely be Adam Henrique. He's a guy that I think would be a perfect fit if the Panthers could make that happen. And I think his playoff experience, he's a longtime veteran. He plays the right way, defensive minded, can give you some scoring punch, can fit in anywhere in the middle six. I think he'd be an excellent addition. There's a few guys on here. Tyler Johnson is one that could make a lot of sense. If you're looking for scoring punch, I could see Kevin LeBanc. I could see I could see someone like Jack Roslovic. I could see a few of those names. I could see Kasperi Kapanen. I don't know how I'd feel about that, but that's an interesting one to me. And then I guess we're kind of in a situation where we're going to be monitoring which teams are kind of on the bubble right now and which ones may fall out of the race, because if a team like Detroit, for example, somehow falls out of the playoff race by trade deadline time and decides they're going to sell, they've got some really intriguing pieces on that team that I think could be really good additions. Guys like David Perron, Daniel Sprong, those are guys that I could see making sense. But for me, one name that we didn't touch on here that it would be interesting to look at from an optics perspective, but a name that would make sense to me is Anthony Duclair. If you get to the trade deadline, and San Jose will definitely be selling, if you get to the trade deadline and he's a guy you could have back at a real discount, just a draft pick or something like that, because I would be shocked if he were interested in signing long term in San Jose. What better player to bring in than a guy who contributed in your last playoff run, already knows the system. There's obviously not a single player on the market who would be able to slide right into the Panther system the way Anthony Duclair could, given that he's played in it and was successful in it last year. I think Anthony Duclair would make a lot of sense if you're missing scoring punch and you need someone to come in and fill the role in your middle six. he can play on any of those top three lines. I think he would make a lot of sense. So I would not necessarily be shocked to see the Panthers bring Duclair back at the deadline. We've seen crazier things happen, and that would not surprise me at all. But like you said, it has to be all about fit here. The Panthers don't have the assets to go for a giant fish. You have to get the guys at discounts and guys that you can have for minimal draft picks or mid-tier prospects. You can't afford to go for broke in the trade market with your top prospects and draft picks anymore. So we've seen teams be successful with that. We've seen Colorado pick up a guy like Andrew Cogliano for what was it, a 5th round, 6th round pick?
Josh Manson.
Josh Manson was a guy that they got for draft picks. It's about fit, and it's about getting guys at a cost that doesn't mortgage your future. And the Panthers are in a position now. So I think if we're looking at teams, I'm looking at San Jose as a team to maybe poach some players. I'm looking at Anaheim. Definitely looking at Chicago. They've got some veterans on that team that could really contribute, and monitoring Detroit, because if they tend to fall off towards the trade deadline and end up being a seller, which is possible, they've been slumping. That's a team I would look at as well, with some really intriguing players that could help a playoff run.
Yeah, and going back to Adam Henrique, his cap hit is almost $6 million, so that will be a situation where you'll probably have to keep 25% of his salary. Another one that I would like quickly, but I don't think it'll happen, Jordan Eberle. I would love to see Jordan Eberle, but I do think that the Seattle Kraken, as far as leadership and building a culture, I do think that he will find himself staying there in Seattle as well. So that would be one that would be a big wish list. And Jordan Eberle does have a great resume going back to junior. Before the record for points in World Juniors was broken last year, it was Jordan Eberle who had the previous record as far as that's. But don't think that will happen, in my opinion. But we're going to transition over to segment number 3, where we are going to discuss more about the state of the farm and what a call-up could possibly spark as far as after the roster freeze. We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better place to get in on the action. The app is super easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. And with the NFL season coming to a close and Tyreek Hill needing an average of 150 yards in the next 3 games in order to get to up to 2,000 yards. If you want to go over a certain number for him as the Miami Dolphins take on the Dallas Cowboys, you could place that all on FanDuel.com. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and to kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Third and final segment here on this Wednesday, December 20th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Winans Wednesday edition of the show. So, Jacob, so I put out a poll late-ish last night about when the roster freeze is over, which will be December 27th. What if the Panthers after that, if they should recall Mackie Samoskevich? Oh, by the way, Justin sort of was sent down before the freeze. So all signs indicate that Anton Lindell could be activated for Thursday because there is an open roster spot. So that with players activated off IR, that's not part of the freeze. So looks like Anton Lindell will be back on Thursday against the St. Louis Blues. So the poll question asked was, should the Panthers recall Mackie Samoskevich? And I'm surprised. I was actually very shocked by how overwhelmingly it was of people saying absolutely. It was 70. Currently, it's 74% to 26 right now, as far as that. And part of me is thinking, no, stick to the plan. But then there's a part of me that's thinking, call them up for a little bit, get a little bit of a spark, get the guys going, and all. But then there's a part of me that's like, you don't want to rely too much on a young guy to carry the offense, because Mackie is not going to be the reason why Kachuk gets in the dirty areas and scores or and all. And he himself is not going to fix the Florida Panthers power play as far as the Panthers trying to do quick passing from behind the net and feeding Sam Reinhart to the bumper. So Mackie's not going to do all of that as far as that. But Mackie is having is getting on the score sheet more often. 6 goals, 11 assists in 17 games, and 4 assists a weekend in a back-to-back. So and Justin sort of is starting to get it going. 12 points in 17 games as well. So I know you had a few tweets during the last game about calling up Mackie and all. So what are you making of the poll and how overwhelmingly it is for people wanting Mackie Samoskevich back in the mix?
Yeah, I think I think it'd be a good time right after the roster freeze to bring him back. I think right now you can't really keep running with Nick Cousins in your middle six, right, as it stands at the moment. On the third line, he's not producing much. They tried him on the second line again with Bennett and Kachuk. It didn't work. I think it's at a point now where you've got to kind of cut your losses with that roster decision. Nick Cousins is more effective in a fourth line role. Honestly, I can't even really say he's necessarily outplayed Jonah Gadjevich or even Steven Lorentz for a fourth line role. So I wouldn't even be shocked if he ends up in a situation where he could be rotating healthy scratches the way his game has looked recently. And part of that could just be him being misused and having too much responsibility. If you put him on the fourth line, maybe he finds his game. But I don't think he can continue to play on the third line. And I think Mackie is ready. I think in preseason with Etu, Lindell, and Mackie, that looked like a really solid line. I think he's really found his comfort zone right now in the pro game. He's had multi-point games now for Charlotte. He's been on a bit of a scoring streak. He's found his goal-scoring touch. I would like to see him keep it rolling in Charlotte and just have that ability to grow and develop there. So if that is the decision, I can respect that, and I understand that for development reasons. But it's on the veterans with the Panthers now. No one is entitled to their spot on the roster, and the bottom six right now is not producing. So if there's a young kid who's ready to take your job, then that's where it is. And I think Mackie is pushing right now. He's knocking on the door, and I think he can. I think if he comes in in a third line role or even in a second line role, I feel like he can produce better than what we're getting right now. And I think also the second power play unit could really use some a scorer on the right wing or someone who can at least set up passes to that left wing side. And I think he's a guy who could really make a difference there. It's just lacking some creativity right now on the third line and even the second line. I think either one of those places he could contribute, and he's a really creative offensive player, can really provide a spark. So I think it's a creativity issue where it's just a little bit stale, and he's a guy who can come in and make some plays. He has the high hockey IQ, the skill level. I think he can make plays creatively that the Panthers are missing.
Yeah, and you think about with power play too, what some of the guys who are there or rotate there at least. I mean, you have your two defensemen, OEL and Ekblad, which I would love to see more of Ekblad fed on the left flank. Especially what we saw 2 seasons ago, that he was producing a lot right before all those injuries as well. But then you think about offensive upside to Anton Lundell and Etu Luostarinen, who also rotate there from time to time. And it's crazy because it also feels like a logjam as well, as far as power play 1, with Sam Bennett being on power play 2, but can rotate there so often. But also Mackie Samoskevich, power play 2, offensive upside for him. It's no secret that that he has more of that than Eetu Luostarinen and Anton Lundell as far as the future as well. So can that provide the spark for power play too, even though they don't get as much ice time there as well. So that's another thing to consider when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think he could be really effective on the second power play unit, which has looked kind of lifeless at times because they don't really have a guy who's a super fast, dynamic puck carrier. It's the zone entry that's a problem, and Evan Rodriguez on power play too has done a decent job of carrying the puck in, but outside of him, there's really no one. Sometimes it's Sam Bennett, sometimes it's Carter Verhaeghe, but those guys are kind of rotating on power play 2, power play 1, so you don't really know which one it's going to be on a nightly basis. And personally, I don't like Carter Verhaeghe being the puck carrier on that unit because I want him in a shooting position the second he crosses the blue line. So him having to carry the puck in, pass it off, and then get set up in a shooting position, that's a lot to ask for a second unit that you're usually on the ice for maybe 45, 50 seconds, and you're killing a lot of time trying to get set up that way. So I think if you can get a guy like Mackie on the second power play, he's a guy who can carry the puck in, he can feed it to the point, and then if you get it to him on the right wing, there's a lot of options because he has a great wrist shot. He's great at those cross ice passes, and I think his creativity, being able to have some open ice on a power play unit, I think that's where he could really find his confidence and be able to get on the score sheet at the NHL level. That right now, whether it's Eetu, whether it's Anton Lundell, whether it's Nick Cousins and the power play minutes he's gotten, there's really a black hole on that side of the power play unit for power play 2. And I think Mackie could fill it and actually produce if put in that spot, especially if you have Ekblad on the opposite side, on the one-timer side. Mackie's a guy who can get those pucks across to him in shooting position. So I think it's something you have to consider. He's playing well enough now. You can afford to let him go through some growing pains. I don't expect him to produce immediately, but right now there's no production from proven veterans. So I'd rather a young guy come up and not produce for a few games, but develop his game because there's infinitely more upside with a guy like Mackie Samoskevich versus continuing to roll out Nick Cousins in a role that's maybe not best suited for his style.
Yeah, and let's go to quickly on Evan Rodriguez. Outside of those 2 4-point games that he has, if you subtract those games, it's 13 points in 29 games. So, and he's playing on the top line as well. So, numbers can be inflated and skewed due to performances, certain game performances as well. But that's also a result of Barkov and Reinhart just doing their thing. So as well. So that's another note as far as that for the Florida Panthers. Quickly as well, Spencer Knight, as far as 14 games, 7 games of them under 900 save percentage, 7 of them over, 2 shutouts. But it looks like the Panthers are going to be sticking to the status quo. But 933 save percentage over the weekend, one of them being a shutout. The good thing is for Spencer Knight, the shutout came at the front end of the back-to-back. I'd rather have that at the front end. And then the second end, you're thinking, okay, maybe a lot of mileage in the last 2 days. So great for Spencer Knight as he's continuing to improve, who has 2 shutouts this year in AHL Charlotte. But with Mackie Samoskevich, if there is a call-up, still you're not putting all your eggs in one basket for him getting the scoring and all as far as that. But he could definitely create that boost for this Florida Panthers team. But Jacob, I want to thank you so much once again for joining me on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Another successful Winans Wednesday, my friend. Tell everybody where they can follow you online.
Yep, you can follow me on X at Jacob Winans 8. And definitely, given that this is our last show together before the holidays, happy holidays to you, Merry Christmas, and to all the viewers and listeners out there, happy holidays. Enjoy the time with your families.
Thank you once again, Jacob. And I will see you next week, my friend.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Steve Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So I'm Armando Velez with Jacob Winans, and you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.